Hello and welcome to 168 Hours. My name is Razmik Martirosyan and I have a distinguished guest today, Dr. Pietro Shakarian, a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of History and National Research University, Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, and returning lecturer at the American University of Armenia. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr.
Razmik,
Shakarian.
it's a pleasure to be on your show, and it's a pleasure to talk to you today.
Dr. Shakarian, let's begin with the recent developments in Armenia.
Okay.
Actually, we have really sad developments here. We have seen the authorities taking steps against the Armenian Apostolic Church, including the arrest of Samuel Karapetyan for his public defense of the church, and also the arrest of clergy members.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on this?
Well, well, first of all, two things have to be unpacked with this. Number one is the development of kind of color revolutionary leaderships in the post-Soviet space, cracking down on the religious authorities, cracking down on the Orthodox Church. So in our case, we have the Armenian Apostolic Church. Pashinans is going after them, and very hard actually, in a very rude and disrespectful way. And really, even though now he's trying to kind of assure Armenians that, well, look, I'm not going after the church, I'm going after these guys, they're not in the spirit of, Jesus Christ and all this and that. The reality is, at the end of the day, he has actually really, gone against even the institutions. I mean, look at what we witnessed with Echmiadzin. It was a complete disgrace. Look at the kind of language he was using toward the Armenian Apostolic Church. So, I mean, even if you don't like certain clergy or whatever, you don't use that sort of language against, this institution, this storied institution. I mean, we look at Armenia being the first nation to adopt the Christianity. Scholars, of course, debate the exact, date, but the first Christian nation, the year 301, this is the traditional date of the adoption of Christianity of Armenia. Also think that the Armenian alphabet, the Armenian architecture, so much of what is uniquely Armenian is tied in with the church. The church also played in history, because I can say this as a historian who's studied the history of Armenia, that really the church played a role in preserving the Armenian national identity through the centuries when there was the loss of Armenian statehood, let's say. So you have that, but also this trend can be observed in other former Soviet republics. So like Moldova, we see this also going on in Ukraine with Zelensky.
But not in this way,
well,
like Pashinyan does.
Well, but Ukraine, it's pretty bad. I mean, what Zelensky is doing is pretty awful too. But with Armenia, what's so remarkable about this is that the church is so fundamental to the Armenian identity, to our identity, that that's why I think it's hitting us even more. That how could any Armenian leader say what he's saying against the Catholicos? I mean, it's just like, to me, it's like just amazing that you would have such a political leader as this who feels empowered to go against the church. I think also it's due to the fact that the church is the one independent institution that really can, go against the government, that has this moral authority, that has the complete trust of the Armenian society. All you need to do is to go to the Zorovor Asfatsin church here in Yerevan on a Sunday, and you see how packed it is. There are people flowing out of the church, right? And that tells you a lot about the placement, the place of the church in Armenian society. And the second thing I want to mention about this is with regard to not only the church, but Samuel Karapetyan, is also we have the broader geopolitical context of the war between, on one side, Israel and the United States, but with Iran. So this war of the United States and Israel against Iran, the so-called 12-day war, really woke up, in particular Russia, to the vulnerability of Iran, especially as a very, very important country in BRICS, right? And so what you're seeing is a certain degree of fear on the part of Pashinyan that now that Russia and Iran are seeing more and more this importance of the Caucasus region, they're seeing more and more the kind of very negative role that Azerbaijan is playing in the region, that now more attention will be paid to the Caucasus and more attention will be paid to Armenia, and more pressure will be put on Pashinyan. This is what Pashinyan is concluding. So that's why I think he feels like he's under pressure and he's like lashing out. He thinks that there is going to be a greater kind of external threat against his political position, because now Russia and Iran see the greater value of Armenia as a force for kind of consolidating the Caucasus in the kind of the BRICS context versus kind of the shall we say east-west kind of corridors that Turkey and Azerbaijan and the West have been, NATO have been sponsoring for quite some time, actually, as a matter of fact.
So do you see the role of Turkey and Azerbaijan in the background of these events? I mean, Pashinyan's actions against the church.
Well, I think yes, to a certain degree. But I think Pashinyan more is acting at behest of kind of the Western interest of really kind of checking or checkmating this kind of rise of BRICS, because Iran is a very, very important country in the BRICS. Not only for Russia, because for Russia we have again this talk about the North-South corridor, but also for China, for the One Belt, One Road initiative, because that goes from China through to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and then into Iran. So for China, Iran is a very important country that connects with West Asia. And also, Iran is a very important country that connects the BRICS, China and Russia, also to India, to South Asia. So think about that geography, the placement of the Iranian plateau. So we talk about the Armenian plateau, we talk about the Armenian highland. This is the Iranian plateau. And the strategic significance of that area, of historical Iran, of historical Persia, that is a major reason why a lot of this is coming to head now. In addition, of course, to antagonism between Iran and Israel, leading up to the so-called 12-day war, and so on and so forth. But this is another element of it, this kind of competition between BRICS and the West, although, really, there shouldn't be a competition. There doesn't need to be a competition. It can be that, United States, the United States recognizes that it is one of many players in the world, and that they can work together with these other larger powers to cooperate and make the world a better place, and have, multiple corridors that, allow for trade and prosperity and all this. But of course, this is not how things are playing out. It's an all or nothing game where there is either a north-south vector or an east-west vector. And Pashinyan has really decided to ally himself with this kind of east-west vector, which he calls the crossroads of the world, or crossroads of peace, or whatever kind of language he likes to use. And that's kind of where this all comes in. I think it's more, I think of course there is a hand of Turkey here, but I think it is more behind that, this kind of geopolitical intrigues, specifically of kind of, war hawks in the United States who want to kind of preserve this idea of American unipolarism, American hegemony, and that's why we're seeing this kind of push toward Iran, toward the Caucasus, toward Central Asia, because this is seen as an effort to kind of preserve Western or American specifically unipolarity. And I think actually it's a big waste of resources, and I think actually for the United States would be better off focusing more on its domestic affairs and building itself up at home, and then that way they would still have a place at the multipolar table. But the problem is the United States, the many people in the Beltway, in the think tanks, in the security establishment, think about this idea of great power competition. They think about this idea of preserving this so-called American unipolar moment, or kind of restoring the American unipolar moment. There's this idea that, almost like this Hobbesian idea, that if America does not have the preeminent position in the world, then the whole world will go and become a complete mess, where life is kind of like, brutish and short and so on and so forth. And I think that that mentality in the end is not going to help the United States. And I think, again, the United States would be better off if it focused more on its internal affairs and strengthened itself internally, and then also kind of played a role on the global stage as one of many powers sitting at the table, talking about greater issues affecting all humanity.
By the way, Nikol Pashinyan recently said in Istanbul that Turkey's Turan project isn't necessarily a threat for Armenia. He even seemed to welcome the idea of regional corridors. What risks do you see here?
I think it's a very naive idea to think that there's no risk for Armenia, because if we look at the history, obviously, of the Armenian genocide of 1915, a major motivating factor for the the Young Turk regime, for Talib Pasha and Enver Pasha, was this idea of the pan-Turanism, pan-Turkism that would basically stretch all the way to Central Asia. We should also not forget the fact that Enver Pasha was fighting in Central Asia, right? That's how much he was fighting, with this kind of Basmachi revolts in Central Asia. So, this whole idea of the Turan project, the pan-Turkic project, goes back to the very idea of exterminating the Armenian people on their historical homeland, and exterminating the Armenian people once and forever. The only thing, again, that really saved Armenia in the end was the preservation of Eastern Armenia as the Soviet Armenia. And basically what this would do, if this project is implemented to the fullest, is it would basically kind of, in the longer term, it would really kind of sadly kind of finish what the executioners of the genocide started. Because then Eastern Armenia now is under threat. We see already what happened with Artsakh Nagorno-Karabakh. Yeah. I mean, and we see the threat to Sunik for Armenia, the threat to the Zangazor corridor, and so it's a very serious issue. One thing I can say that is actually quite fortunate is the fact that this Turan project, Turkey has maybe it has the motivation for trying to seek the realization of this plan, but at the end of the day, its resources are limited in terms of realizing it. It has very strong active NGO activity in Central Asia, but the Central Asian elites and leaderships are not so much on board with this idea. They still are, at the end of the day, more or less pro-Russian. And so this is why actually the Russians, even though they recognize in the larger picture the greater Turan as a threat, they're like thinking, well, in the final analysis, we can control this, because in Central Asia, we still are kind of in the dominant position there.
But can they really control it?
Well, that's the big question, because now we see what's happened. So the Russians took a very relaxed position toward our region, and you see what happened with Artsakh, unfortunately, in the events of 2023.
But
the ethnic cleansing
we see also what's going on in Russian-Azerbaijani relations.
Well, this is a whole other issue. But see, this is I want to say this, Razmik, that this is directly connected with what we've seen in the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, because what happens is it emboldened Aliyev. Aliyev did not say, oh yes, now I got what I wanted, I'm going to come home and everything. No, he wants more. And not only that, I mean, it's not only about necessarily maybe his ambitions on Sunik or even on Armenia as a whole, because he talks about this idea of Western Azerbaijan, but even the Iranian Azerbaijan, which the Azerbaijani nationalism is referred to as the Southern Azerbaijan, especially in the context of this recent war, with Israel and the United States against Iran. That they're also this threat to maybe kind of instigating separatism in Iran's distinctive ethnic regions, like Iranian Azerbaijan, or like Baluchistan, or like in any of these other places, Iranian Kurdistan. That the threat to that is very much real. And there were some analysts, for example, in Armenia, who would say, well, look at the airplane incident that happened recently, where basically, and I will be quite frank with you, the evidence actually shows that this plane that crashed, this airplane that crashed, which the Azerbaijanis said was shot down, that flew over the Caspian Sea, it's more likely that this was bird interference. Why do we say that? Because even if there was some slight damage that had occurred from some Ukrainian drone flying as the plane was flying over Russian airspace, it wasn't enough to bring down the plane, because the plane, what happened was it went then north, and then it went over the entire Caspian Sea, which is not a small space. And then it only began to act erratic as it approached the Kazakh coast, the coast of Kazakhstan. So that would indicate to me that we're dealing really, as the Russians and the Kazakhs say, with a bird interference problem. But yet Aliyev still, despite all that, was emphasizing that this was a plane shot down by the Russians. On top of that, we have these most recent issues with Yekaterinburg, with the Azerbaijani crime network that the Russians were busting up, and the reaction of Azerbaijan to that. The arrest of Russian citizens, the arrest of a Russian tourist. You know, if you have to think, if you're a Russian tourist who wants to go to Baku, you wouldn't feel safe there, going there anymore. When you see that some guy is just, you know, taken off the street, beaten up badly. I mean, if that's not like a kind of a slap in the face to the Russians, a kind of like, really, it's a complete act of disrespect. I don't know what is. But it shows you that really at the end of the day, the Russians, I mean, again, their main focus was Ukraine, but it shows you that this slow, methodical approach to the war in Ukraine makes Russia quite vulnerable to other fronts, to maybe a second front beginning in another place, like with Azerbaijan, or like, I don't know, even with Moldova or with Central Asia or whatever. And so that actually is also putting pressure even in the Russian society on the Russian government. Why aren't we, you know, moving faster? You know, you hear Russians on the street saying things like, well, you know, in the Second World War, we defeated the Nazi war machine. Why can't we, you know, defeat these guys in Ukraine so quickly? You know, that's what people are saying. But more and more and more, Razmik, that kind of talk is coming into the Russian leadership, the Russian elites. And especially these events in Azerbaijan really put into relief that Russia has been taking a very, very passive position toward the Caucasus, in a very kind of hands-off position, and that this is, in the long term, the longer this goes on, where Russia does not play an active role in the regional processes, beyond just simply kind of diplomatic talks or calls for peace or whatever, then the more Russia's position is going to be undermined. And that's why I'm saying that also, especially with this war with Iran, and now that the threat has been raised again of maybe efforts to balkanize Iran, to break up Iran. Although the war demonstrated that quite the opposite, that the Iranians, across ethnic lines, whether you're Iranian Azerbaijani or you are Iranian Kurd or whatever, that the nationalism in Iran is so strong that actually what we saw in this process was not kind of a fracturing of society as was anticipated by Israel and the United States, but actually a greater rallying around the flag. And so Iran proved to be more consolidated, but that doesn't mean that the threat of trying to kind of break up Iran or interfere in the internal affairs of Iran is over. I mean, after all, Israel was able to penetrate Iran with its spies, and this was, a very serious issue. Also, Azerbaijan and Israel have very close relations, as we know, and Azerbaijan was used by Israel in these attacks against Iran. So, at the end of the day, for Russia, as Russia was seeing this war unfold before its eyes, it put into stark relief the fact that they needed to take a more proactive position toward the Caucasus region, toward this very, very strategic area between the Black and Caspian Seas.
Will we see it, but what do you think?
I think we will, but I don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah.
But the good news, Razmik, is that we see already kind of the realization and the kind of the motivation, the motive, that there is now this sense that we've been taking our eyes off the ball, as it were, and we need to now focus on this region. Plus, also the other thing I wanted to say is the events in Syria. So what happened, the fall of Assad in Syria, that was another shock to the Russians. Many Russian elites thought, yes, maybe we can talk to Turkey, maybe we can trust Azerbaijan. Although, I'm sure, so yes, there were Russian elites who were talking in this way, but the Russian intelligence and the Russian military, I'm sure, they knew well the reality of Turkey and Azerbaijan. Because, again, it's impossible to ignore the fact that for, basically 3 decades, Aliyev, the government in Azerbaijan, has been very, very close to the very Western interests that now seek to kind of inflict a strategic defeat on Iran. Or excuse me, well, actually both, just to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia and Iran, and also ultimately, in the final analysis, China. because, and actually China is watching this very, very closely as well. It's because it's also a concern for them.
And they are talking about this openly, by
yeah,
the
they're
way.
talking about this openly. And so it really kind of ran the reality home to the Russians that this is a very serious issue. Although now it's interesting, because before, from the Armenian point of view, if we were saying that Russia was being too passive, but Iran is being much more active in our region. Now all of a sudden it's interesting because we're seeing a little bit of kind of a reverse, where Russia now is becoming very active in terms of its reaction to these recent events with Azerbaijan. But Iran, we're seeing now, Pezeshkian, he's visiting the occupied Artsakh Nagorno-Karabakh.
But he was criticized in Iran as well.
He was criticized in Iran for that too. And I'll tell you though the context of that, which is actually quite important, that there is a faction in the Iranian elite, which they call the North Tehran faction, which is very much trusting of the West. And this faction has lost, Razmik, a lot of political credibility in the aftermath of this, or in the aftermath of this war. Because imagine this. You are Iran. It's an ancient country, an Eastern country. You are negotiating on good faith with the United States over this nuclear issue. Negotiating. And then as you're negotiating, you're being attacked by Israel, by the United States, by Israel with the help of the United States, and again, like I said, by the United States directly. And how do you feel after that? And also, not only that, the role of the IAEA and Mr. Grossi in these events, that also does not help the situation with those in Iran, the North Tehran crowd. And I'm talking here not only about Mr. Pezeshkian, but also about Mr. Zarif, who were saying, we can talk to the West, we can trust the West, we can negotiate and all this. Well, really what happened was something similar to what we saw with Minsk, where the Russians dealt in good faith with the Europeans over the Minsk Accords, over Ukraine. And what happened? Suddenly, when the war of 2022 broke out with regard to Ukraine, that you heard Merkel and Hollande state that, well, the Minsk Accords were a ruse, that we were using this to buy time to build up Ukraine to use it against Russia. And that's how the Iranians are feeling quite similar in this respect with regard to this war that was just, fought. That they feel we were negotiating in good faith, that our trust was violated, that we were pursuing the diplomatic path. And now what's incredible about this, Razmik, is that the United States, Mr. Trump and Mr. Witkoff want to have Iran return to the table.
Do they want it?
And that's the question. And the Iranians, how can they trust them? If you're Mr. Aragchi, how can you trust them? You can't. It's very hard to trust them. But still, unfortunately, we see from this kind of North Tehran crowd, there still is this kind of naivete about, oh yes, we can talk and da and all this. And even these events with Azerbaijan in Iran, this kind of visiting of, Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, that this can be viewed as an extension of it, because again, the information came out that yes, Azerbaijan was using or was allowing Israel to use its territory to launch attacks on Iran. I mean, if we look at, for instance, the Zangazor Rayon of Azerbaijan, that there are so-called kind of, you have this, smart village project, which is really, we're talking about Potyomkin village, where really this is acting as kind of like cover for like Mossad or for Israel to use as kind of a kind of a forward base against Iran. And then all of a sudden now you have like a statement from Pezeshkian saying, oh yes, well, there's nothing here, it's not such a big deal, and that.
Maybe they want to control the situation in that way.
Well, I think that also is a possibility too. So I think that maybe.
But what's interesting? In Armenia, like, people were criticizing the Iranian president for visiting Artsakh, occupied Artsakh. But we have Nikol Pashinyan, who said that Artsakh is Azerbaijan now.
This is the big issue that actually most people feel, because again, what can you say to that? I mean, that yes, Armenians can feel enraged about this, rightfully so. in particular Armenians in Iran, because there's a substantial Armenian community in Iran, or even Armenians from Iran in other parts of the Armenian diaspora, or even Armenians from Iran in Armenia watching this, it's especially painful. But then, how do you respond to the fact that Nikol Pashinyan, the Armenian prime minister, recognized, Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan?
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that he does this, I think that it's
just
astounding.
What Zatulin said about this event, he said like recently after this Russian Azerbaijani tense situation, he said that without Karabakh, the whole Transcaucasus framework has collapsed.
It's not an exaggeration to say that.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's saying that really means there's a realization in Russia that they let the situation go too far. Russia still has a lot of cards to play. It hasn't lost its position, really fully in the Caucasus. One thing actually that strikes me, which is quite interesting, is for example, when I'm living in St. Petersburg, and I'm watching the news coming out of Armenia, I watch these commentaries by, Alexander Iskandarian, a good, analyst, but. And what he was saying, which was quite interesting, is that, Russia has lost its influence in the Caucasus and so on and so forth. But interestingly enough, when I come here every time, thinking that I'm going to see less Russia, I go on the streets in Yerevan and I hear Russian all over the place. The Russian culture is still very much in vogue in Armenia. Also, the place of the Russian economy in Armenia is huge. That the dram actually would not be performing so well without the ruble. And the dram actually is performing incredibly well, even against the dollar. I mean, we see now it's really, quite strong. But this is not necessarily because of any success of the part of the Armenian government. It's simply because of the consequence of Armenia's close association with the Russian economy. And this also brings me to another point, which is if this current government were to undermine that, which it has made some noise about its intent to do that, then it would really, really hurt Armenia in a very dramatic way. But in terms of Zatulin's specific remark, Russia still has cards to play. They still have a coercive, leverage over Azerbaijan. But again, they're hesitant to use this as long as they are still in the war in Ukraine. There is a strong feeling in Russia, because I talked to many Russian specialists about this, that they're afraid of being tricked into opening a second front, or being, kind of lured into a second front.
But it's happening now.
But it's happening. And that's something that, regardless, even if they don't want it, Azerbaijan has made, because the other thing you also have to think, when the Russians understood to some extent that Azerbaijan was too hot to handle, and they thought that if we conclude kind of like a treaty of alliance, on the eve of the SMO, the Special Military Operation in Ukraine, that we can kind of keep this situation under wraps. Azerbaijan is not going to step out of line, if we kind of make some quick agreement with them. But at the end of the day, that didn't really work necessarily. Plus also you had a government in Yerevan that was eager to kind of, wriggle out of the influence of Russia. That it really wanted to kind of pull itself out from the Russian influence. Already you have to think, even before the attacks of September 2022, which gave Pashinyan the very convenient excuse and pretext to recognize Artsakh as Azerbaijan in October 2022, that before all this, Pashinyan was talking about the new era of peace. He was talking about kind of an intensive normalization with Turkey, not really a kind of a normalization based on pragmatism or on kind of principled interests, as we've seen with past Armenian governments, but really kind of a normalization that was just giving the store all away to kind of make the economy work and to kind of reorient Armenia toward the West. Really, not necessarily because the economy is already working, but the idea would be to kind of, in Pashinyan's view, and also in the view of his supporters, people like Erasure, the idea was really that somehow if we have this normalization with Turkey, then it would boost the Armenian economy, and we would just open the door to Turkish investment without doing any protections on Armenian products.
Now they are saying we'll go to Europe.
Yeah, we'll go to Europe, but that's not going to happen, Razmik.
Why?
because what's going to happen is actually it's going to be Armenia is going to go to Turkey. It's not going to go to Europe. Armenia would be integrated as almost like a kind of a dependency of Turkey. It would be more or less like a province of Turkey.
By the way,
look at what happened with Ajaria. I mean, under Mikhail Saakashvili opened up Ajaria in Georgia to kind of complete Turkish business investment with no restrictions. And you see what happened. Ajaria was becoming more and more dominated by Turkish businesses. And to the point where Erdogan felt comfortable enough to say that Batumi is ours. So there you go.
So there are a lot of similarities with...
Yes, with Georgia and Armenia. Do you want to go into that, or do you...
I would like to ask you about Erdogan again. After Pashinyan's visit, Erdogan stated that Armenia was initially against the so-called Zangazor corridor, but is now taking a more flexible approach to economic integration.
I think that's a terrible move on the part of Armenia, and it's very dangerous. Because first of all, the Zangazor corridor in general, as an idea, is quite concerning with regard to Armenia's sovereignty, because it would mean Armenia would have to basically realize what was known. So I'm going to take you a few years back here. What was once known as kind of the global plan, the idea of back when there were negotiations over the Artsakh issue, the idea was, well, let's cede a corridor in Megri in the south to Azerbaijan, and then we will gain a corridor, the Lachin corridor, connecting Armenia with Artsakh, proper. That there was this kind of talk going on, kind of connecting the two corridors in negotiations. But really, what we effectively have now is really a situation where it's just kind of like a demand for a single corridor, a unilateral corridor, because Pashinyan gave away, as we know, Karabakh, or he disavowed Karabakh. He disavowed Artsakh, I should say. It's also important to also stress this. We say Karabakh, but I mean, I'm saying Karabakh here. But we should really make a point to distinguish between mountainous Karabakh, that is Artsakh, versus the lowland Karabakh, right? So this term applied really to Artsakh. We should always be indicating whenever we say Karabakh that this is mountainous, that this is Artsakh mountainous Karabakh or Nagorno Karabakh, but not Karabakh in general. Anyway, that's kind of like a kind of a digression. But the idea that of kind of ceding sovereign Armenian territory is already quite dangerous. And you look at it from the context of the November statement of 2020. If we're talking about the Russians controlling it, that's a better deal than Armenia kind of completely ceding it. What really, really, really concerns me about Mr. Erdogan's statement with regard to Mr. Pashinyan, and against supposedly Pashinyan consenting to this, is that it almost implies that Armenia would be okay with a so-called Zangazor corridor, where they're ceding sovereign territory to Azerbaijan, without any Russian presence. That it wouldn't be, so the idea would be that it wouldn't be sovereign Armenian territory where there would be like a highway and there would be Russians patrolling it. It would be a situation where, you can see that he would be even ceding Armenian land to Azerbaijan, and not just any Armenian land, like Megri and Agarak, which provide the link between Iran and Armenia, and in the greater context, between Iran and the Eurasian Economic Union, and also between Iran and ultimately Russia.
That's why Iran warns that it's a red line for them. It's
a huge red line. Although, I have to say this also, we're hearing increasingly more and more assertive statements also from the Russian side about this. Before, Russia was kind of trying to balance things out, this kind of thing. But now we actually hear, like, for instance, there was recently an interview on the Grung podcast, where basically Fyodor Lukyanov was saying that for Russia, this Zangazor issue is also a red line. We're not going to tolerate any territorial changes.
But there is the impression that they don't care about it. They just want to control the corridor. That's all.
No, they do care about it, because if controlling it also indicates a certain degree of care, because they don't want to see the corridor in the hands of Turkey or Azerbaijan itself. If they're controlling it,
but the idea of corridor is already a threat for Armenia.
It is, actually, as a matter of fact. But the Russians think that, you know, if we have our men there, then we can control it. Maybe we can even like revise the terms. If we control,
we saw they are controlling Nagorno-Karabakh in Artsakh.
well, this is unfortunately this is a situation that the Russians, you know, have to face. You know, I mean that this is something that their credibility, their international credibility, and their credibility in this part of the world is at stake because of what happened in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah.
It's an objective problem for them in terms of their soft power, especially because you also have to think, Razmik, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh were never really for Pashinyan. They were never supporting this movement from the start of Pashinyan. They never voted for him. They were always probably the most pro-Russian element in the Armenian society. And so for them to suffer as a result of Pashinyan's moves, I mean, and even, I'll tell you something else, even in the Russian...
Nagorno-Karabakh, they voted for Araik Harutyunyan, who is kind of a brother of Nikol
Well,
Pashinyan.
yes.
Of course, he's now in Baku,
Yeah.
and we are not going to...
I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the case too, but I'm saying that, yes, there was that, you know, voting for him, but at the end of the day, people were not, in general, were not really so enthusiastic about Pashinyan himself. On top of that, there is another point that needs to be emphasized, which is that in the Russian society, especially in light of these Azerbaijani events, that even in the Russian society, it's been very difficult for the Russian press, the Russian media, to sell the narrative that simply because of Pashinyan's recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh, that alone caused this situation. That's actually quite interesting, that the Russians themselves, the Russian people, don't feel completely convinced that Pashinyan's recognition of Artsakh Nagorno-Karabakh alone was, you know, the only kind of, you know, cause of the ethnic cleansing in Artsakh. That there is a sense that, you know, we kind of, you know, neglected our interests here, not only, you know, in terms of the Armenians, in terms of their position, but also we neglected even our strategic interests. Because yes, there's a humanitarian consideration, there's also this consideration, you know, Armenians and Russians have a long-standing relations and all this, but even in terms of strategic considerations, this was a huge, you know, blow for the Russians. And Russians actually recognize that. And they also tie that to this idea that we're moving too slow in Ukraine. That because we're moving so slow in Ukraine, we have this problem, you know, now in the Caucasus. And now, frankly, more or less, the Azerbaijanis don't respect us. They're not kind of listening to us. There is also another important kind of historical lesson here, if we step back, which is the fact that when we talk about the position of Moscow historically, what is Moscow known as in historical terms? So Moscow is the third Rome, right? Because the Russians see themselves as the inheritors of the Byzantine Empire, the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. And where I'm going with this is there's a historical lesson to be learned here. Because what happened in 1071, the Battle of Manzikert. And you see what happened when there was a weakened Armenia. You see what happened to the Byzantine security. This basically opened up the door to the Seljuk threat to the Byzantine Empire, and gradually it led us to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So, I mean, from the Russian point of view, there is kind of this kind of ghost of Byzantium also that's lurking behind these events too, because we're dealing with Armenia is again acting as kind of this, you know, protector of, you know, the Russian borders, protector of the borders of the inheritors of the Byzantine Empire. And you see that in its weakened position, what kind of a threat this is causing. Yeah.
But do you see like Russians learned a lesson from their own history? Because they had a lot of wars with Turkey, but they are cooperating deeply.
Yeah, they have learned their lesson with Turkey, because what happened most recently, as I mentioned earlier, were the events in Syria. So yeah, Russia thought they could manage the relationship with Turkey, this kind of relationship that was somehow, it could be part partnership, part you know, competition. There was this idea that we could manage
and
somehow.
And they will
Erdogan.
give something from Armenia to Turkey.
Yeah, but also giving too much, not only from Armenia, but giving also in terms of Syria, giving in terms of Libya, giving in terms of this and that. And there was much more giving the Russians see this too. There was much more giving on the Russian side than receiving.
Getting,
yeah. And also then what happens, Turkey turns around, you see, you know, basically they kind of give free pass to the Ukrainian, POWs. There was all sorts of, moments of kind of Turkey turning on Russia, but the biggest of all were the events in Syria. That Turkey's role in Syria really caused a huge shock in the Russian society and led to Russia, the Russians really reassessing their relationship with Turkey. So now there is a kind of a pragmatic, ongoing relationship with the Turks, but the Russians now are way more wary of them, and they have sobered up incredibly over Turkey. There was even talk a year ago, could Turkey join BRICS? Now you don't hear that anymore. Russia does not talk about this anymore. There was even talk among some, could Azerbaijan join BRICS? Now that's completely gone. So that I think is evidence that Russia has learned their lesson, because when you see this, when you see these narratives of, for example, Turkey and Azerbaijan, that these narratives are no longer there, that we can kind of bring them into kind of the, I guess you could say BRICS sphere, that indicates to me that things have, fundamentally changed.
Do you see any solution for Armenia in this situation?
Well, I think the biggest solution for Armenia is I think that it comes down to the Armenian people, and it comes down to the Armenian people finding a new leadership, because this leadership, at the very best, you could say, is incompetent. At the very worst, you could say it's treasonous. Either way, it's a threat to the Armenian national security and the threat to the existence of the Armenian statehood, to the existence of the Armenian people and their historical land, or historical lands, as we can see with Artsakh.
Is it like we should forget about the historical Armenia? We are living in real Armenia. So
yeah, but I mean, when they say this to try and justify what they're doing, but at the end of the day, it's what they're doing is a serious threat to the existence of the Armenian state. And the other thing is, behind all that is the greater geopolitical context, where for Russia and Iran, I mean, already, as we could see, the Artsakh issue was a major setback for the Russians. Imagine the setback if the corridor that's linking Iran with the Eurasian Economic Union is taken out. If that's taken out, that really is going to be a huge thing. Like I said, that the Russians right now, they can manage the situation. I mean, they can manage it even with regard to Armenia, even with Artsakh. I don't think the Artsakh issue is completely closed. I actually still believe it's not completely closed. I think that Pashinyan and the current Armenian government want to close the issue. Aggressively, they want to close the issue. So even when there was the effort to establish kind of an Artsakh government in exile, the Armenian government took a very aggressive position against that. We also see the benefits that were given to the Artsakh Armenians were cut by the government. So the initiative to really put the issue of Artsakh into history, it's not only something that's being supported by Turkey and Azerbaijan, but it's also being supported by this current Armenian government. Whereas I actually think that, for Russia and Iran, they are not opposed to the Artsakh Seas. So I think that when you have this, that sure, Russia, what happened with Artsakh in 2023 was a major setback for the Russians. But I think that the Russians in general would be kind of, they're more or less, I think, supportive of the idea of the Artsakh Seas returning to their land, returning to their homes, because the Russians also emphasize this idea of returning to the spirit and letter of the negotiations of 2020, and I think that the Russians actually don't want to put this issue completely or take it completely off the table. On the other hand, the withdrawal of the Russian peacekeepers, the situation that happened in 2023, that's a major setback for the Russians. Because again, and also it undermines even the military prestige of Russia. Because, when the Russians say, well, look, wherever the Russian flag stands, wherever the Russian flag is raised, it will never be lowered. Well, here in this case, we can see that the Russian flag was lowered. So it actually is a serious problem. It really is a serious issue. And the Russians, though, are waking up to it, and also they're coordinating, I believe, with Iran. I think both Iran and Russia understand the stakes at play, especially also in light of this war that happened. Because again, as I say, the strategy of not only regime change in Iran, where maybe like Israel and the United States would want to overthrow the government in Tehran and put into power, let's say, the Shah's son to take over. But also the idea of, like I mentioned, fragmenting Iran or balkanizing Iran into different kind of ethnic republics, increasing the size of Azerbaijan to include Tabriz. I mean, in the Azerbaijani media, they talk about this idea of, you know, that we should go to Tabriz, that we should, you know, we can attack Tabriz, right? That actually brings me to another point, that the Azerbaijanis, there is some speculation here, you know, in Armenia that could the, you know, the plane issue, the plane incident, or let's say the current issues that we're seeing now in relations, could this be a kind of a tactic by Aliyev to get more negotiating room or some kind of silent consent from the Russians to take Zangazor, Sunik? You know, would this be kind of the idea? But I don't think that's really the case at all. I think that actually Aliyev has grown to be incredibly arrogant, and there's kind of incredible hubris. He thinks that he has the wind to his back. He has complete support of, you know, Israel and Turkey and NATO to do whatever he wants. And so he thinks that, you know, I'm like a new power in the Caucasus, that Azerbaijan is like a so-called middle power.
He mentions about that all the time.
It's not the case, but he's like convinced himself that it is. It's kind of like a mania that he actually really believes in his mind. It's kind of like he like went like temporarily insane, that he believes that he's turned his small little republic into a republic that can openly challenge both Russia and Iran simultaneously. Well, good luck with that. We'll see how it ends up.
And my last question is about your last book. You are
or in my new book,
your new book. You are here in Armenia to publish it, and it's about Anastas Mikoyan and his last reforms in the USSR. So why this topic, and what can readers expect from the book?
Well, this book is, first of all, it's being published in the United States by Indiana University Press. And the book is not a, you know, cradle to grave biography of Mikoyan. It's a book that is kind of a biographical study of Mikoyan, but it focuses on his reforms during the period of the Khrushchev thaw, which includes de-Stalinization, which includes also reforms to nationality policy, giving out more powers to the republics. In particular, we look at the case of Armenia, you know, his patronage for Armenia. Actually, this is actually what's not really well known. And there's extensive evidence of this in both the Russian archives and the Armenian archives. So this book is based largely on, you know, materials in the Russian and Armenian languages, and also from the Russian and Armenian archives. And it really indicates just how deep Mikoyan's role was in Armenian affairs, in de-Stalinization, in maybe acting as kind of like a lobbyist for Armenia on you know, like the Arpa-Sivan tunnel and many other issues like this. The book covers extensively the Nagorno-Karabakh Artsakh issue in the context of Soviet times, Mikoyan's position on this. It also covers the period of the Stalinist repressions in Armenia in extreme, in very, very detailed, in a very detailed way that scholars, even in the literature in Armenian and Russian, have not explored. I mean, I'm actually opening up the door to new material that is not even known widely in Armenia that's relevant to the history of Soviet Armenia, that really nobody knows. I mean, even the role of Mikoyan in de-Stalinization, but also the whole process of the Stalinist repressions, the direct intervention of the Soviet government in Armenian affairs. I mean, to the point that where Moscow was directly running Armenia for a period of about a month in 1937 under Stalin. This history is not well known at all, but my book reveals it. Also, I talk about constitutional reforms, the effort, like I said, of creating, devolving more powers to the republics, to create a new Soviet constitution that would actually democratize the Soviet state. So Khrushchev had this idea to actually create a Soviet constitution that would allow Soviet citizens to have more of a direct say, that would actually create the conditions for popular elections. Now, the Communist Party would still have a monopoly on power, but at the end of the day, it would be a dramatic reform that would dramatically overhaul, you know, the whole course of Soviet history if it had been realized. But it was never realized because Khrushchev in 1964 was overthrown, And Mikoyan played a very big role in supporting Khrushchev, even as he was being overthrown. But in this reform specifically, to kind of, I guess you could say, democratize the Soviet system. And part of it was also because Khrushchev wanted to fight against the bureaucrats. He felt that, you know, if we have a constant update of the bureaucracy through elections, popular elections, then that would help me solve my problems. Plus also, you know, the American president, Mr. Kennedy, is on my back that my elections are not so democratic here in the Soviet Union. So maybe we can have real elections here in the Soviet Union, real democracy. But this is all history that's not known at all. And I have to say that, again, I'm approaching this completely as a scientist, that my work is to a T sourced, cited on everything, on every aspect of it. And so this is just phase one, is just getting this book out in the English edition in the United States, Indiana University Press. But phase two is also to bring it into Armenian translation and into Russian translation, because you know, the Armenian society, also the Russian society, needs to know about this history, because it's the history of Armenia, the history of Russia, the history of the Soviet Union.
When should we expect the Armenian version?
The Armenian version would be coming out most likely next year, although I'm still kind of finalizing the details with the publisher on that, and I'm kind of trying to figure out where that exactly is going to be. But the English edition, I can say, is going to be launched in Yerevan on July 31st at Invino on Saryan Street. And the official release date is August 5th, 2025. So this is where everything is going, but this is again my first profession, my first love is history, and as you can see, and so I guess you could say that you know, kind of geopolitics is my mistress, I guess you could say on that. So on that note, yeah, I mean,
thank you so much for an insightful
you're welcome,
interview.
Razmik. I appreciate it. Love being on your show. Thank you
thank
for
you so
inviting me.
much.
It's always a great pleasure.
Thank you for watching this interview. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.